Welcome back, everyone. I hope you had a chance to get outside, to see the exhibition, to get something to eat, maybe another coffee, as we turn to the last portion of today's program. So I think nicely building on our last session, we're going to turn now to a discussion of labor and expertise. And I know labor and expertise has been a thread that cuts across all of the papers I think that we've heard about in this conference so far. But this one I think will take us into another direction on that topic. And to lead us in conversation on that, we'll have Anna Majeski, who was the curator, actually, of the exhibition across the street, Sketching Splendor. And a lot of this conference, a lot of the themes were really inspired by the terrific work that she did in putting that together. So thank you, Anna, for inspiring all of us to put this conference together. Anna received a PhD in art history from the Institute of Fine Arts from NYU in 2022, and her research focuses on the intersections between art and science in the early modern world. And she's actually going to be leaving us soon. From 2024 to 2025, she'll be the Robert Lehman Fellow at the, I never say this correctly, what is it, the Villa Itati, Harvard Center for Italian Renaissance Studies in Florence. So she's going to Florence for a year. Yeah, we know, we're all so sad for you. To do work on her own book project, which is Powerful Images, Art and Astrology in Renaissance Italy. So we're going to keep with the same format that we've been using all day. Anna will introduce our speakers, each of whom will have 15 minutes to present, and then we'll turn it over to Q&A. Just a reminder to our speakers, and really to everyone, about microphones. Please speak into the microphone so that everybody can hear you, both in person and online. And with that, I will turn it over to Anna.
Thank you, Adriana, for that introduction, and to all of you for sticking it out for the last two sessions of this really wonderful conference. You know, Adriana said that the exhibition inspired this conference, but I will say the kind of ideas and connections that I have, taken out of the papers in this really rich two-day conference far transcend the limited kind of scope of the exhibition. So my warm thanks again to Adriana and to all the other conference organizers, Thomas Johns, for really bringing together just an absolutely fantastic and stimulating set of papers and sessions. So I'll follow the kind of format we've been adopting here today and read all the bios of our speakers at the beginning so that I don't have to keep coming up and interrupting the wonderful papers that we're going to hear in this session. So we're going to start with Ralph Kingston, who is an associate professor of European history at Auburn University and has particular interest in French history, the history of science, material history, and the social history of place and space. He is currently working on a book entitled Going Places, Exploring Spaces, Early 19th Century French Expeditions and the Practice of Scientific Exploration, which investigates the ship as a place and space of scientific inquiry and experiment. And our next speaker will be Luis Ceríaco, a Portuguese zoologist and historian of science. He is currently a researcher at the University of Porto, as well as a research associate at the Carnegie Museum of Natural History and a visiting professor at the National Museum and Federal University of Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. He is an author of more than 100 scientific publications, an enviable number, including 4 books. And his current research covers 2 main topics: systematics and integrative taxonomy of vertebrates, with a focus on the discovery, description, and systematic study of African reptiles and amphibians, and history of science in the Portuguese-speaking world, and the history of zoology and natural history collections. Our third speaker is Hunter Price. He is associate professor in the Department of History at Western Washington University in Bellingham, Washington. He is a scholar of early America, religion in the American South, and the author of Sacred Capital, Methodism, and Settler Colonialisms in the Empire of Liberty, which is forthcoming from the University of Virginia Press. And he is currently beginning a second book, which I think is related to his paper today, which is on the prominent 19th century American scientists John and Joseph LeContes and their place in the legacies of environmentalism and slavery. And last but not least, Ariel Hammond is Director of Research Library and Archives at the San Diego Natural History Museum and an information scientist with a background in digital libraries, archives, and information behavior. She is published on informal information behaviors and the adoption of new technologies, and through her work focuses on digitizing resources, diversifying audiences, and promoting community science. So with that, please join me in welcoming Ralph Kingston for our first paper.
So I'm going to start by warning those of you who ate a lot at lunch. That is a pretty disgusting example at the start of this paper. On March 22nd, 1803, two boats returned to a French exploration ship, the Géographe, at anchor off the coast of Western Australia. The Géographe was a naval vessel sent out in 1800 by the French government with a sister ship, the Naturaliste, and a complement of civilian scientists to explore the South Pacific and to map the coastline of Australia. The two boats in question had been dispatched by the ship's captain and expedition commander, Nicolas Baudin, to Fore, in Australia they call it Foray, island in Shark Bay to catch turtles to replenish the ship's stock of meat. Baudin had additionally instructed the officer in charge to, quote, take care to collect any objects of curiosity and natural history you should happen to find and to hand them all over to me on your return. So while hunting turtles, sailors discovered the putrefying remains of a dugong. This is where I have to choose the right button. No, it is not. So Shark Bay is over there. The putrefying remains of a dugong. Here we go. Half submerged in the sand. It was 6 to 7 feet long and visibly different enough from a seal for the sailors to notice it. There were limits to their enthusiasm, however. Decomposition was well established and the stench of the body was overwhelming. The sailors didn't attempt to turn it over on its back or even to check if it had feet or flippers. The sailors did, however, stick their hands into the putrefying mouth of the dugong and remove 7 of its teeth. The discovery of the dugong was incidental, but its harvesting by the sailors for natural history was done with intent. So in ways like this, sailors were an essential part of natural history collecting on board late 18th and early 19th century ships of exploration. The dugong teeth were a major prize for Baudin and the scientists who traveled with him. They promised to solve a long-debated mystery of what sort of animal head William Dampier had discovered inside a shark's mouth when he visited Shark Bay in 1699. It was only because it was such an exceptional find that the detail of how and who carried out the collection was recorded so explicitly. In general, the contribution made by sailors to the success of scientific expeditions was much less transparent in the expedition journals of the period. Reading through those memoirs and journals, it becomes nonetheless clear that sailors played a significant part in collecting natural history specimens. They did so mostly in undramatic fashion. When Baudin's ships were at anchor, sailors regularly went line fishing. On March 30th, 1803, they landed a magnificent species of amphinomie, which you see here. A sea centipede, 19 centimeters long, richly colored with flecks of gold, crimson, and rose. The amphinomie's voracity ruined the sailors' catch. They couldn't keep their hooks baited. But what was an annoyance to the sailors was highly prized by the natural historians, and the location where it was landed was named Amphinomie Bank, which is now Amphinomie Shoals off the coast of Western Australia. Sailors were collecting, and they were often led to discoveries by their stomachs. Recruited from French maritime provinces, most sailors on Baudin's expedition had grown up fishing in communities on the west coast of France, Le Havre, Fécamp, Honfleur, Dieppe. They adapted their skill and experience to harvest the marine life in their various ports of call. At Rottnest Island in Western Australia, which is up further, they caught and they ate fish they identified as the equivalent of smelt and mackerel they knew from the Atlantic. They gorged on oysters in King George's Sound, which is there in the southwest. However, over the course of the Baudin expedition, sailors realized there were other ways to profit from collecting natural history specimens than just guzzling them down. By the time the Baudin expedition put ashore at Shark Bay in Western Australia in March 1803, a new economy of natural history collecting had been well established. Baudin's instructions might have been to, quote, take care to collect any objects of curiosity and natural history that you should happen to find and hand them all over to me upon your return. But when those boats returned, all such objects were not surrendered to Baudin. Instead, natural history specimens were sold to the scientists. The sailors received payment in rum. What transpired later that evening, however, reveals that the naturalist employ of sailor collectors was destabilizing order and discipline on ship. The rum given to the sailors was quickly consumed. That evening, Baudin grumbled, quote, 16 people were fighting in every corner of the ship, and I was myself obliged to strike several of them in order to obtain peace. This was, he said, not the first time such a disturbance had occurred. He had thought he had, quote, remedied the matter by prohibiting the payment of anything in rum. However, my prohibition is worthless for scientists like ours, and since they consider themselves independent, I gave special order to the ship's steward not to deliver a drop of rum in future without an order signed directly by me. In other words, on March the 2nd, 1803, payment in rum led to a general melee on board the Géographe. 16 soldiers is basically a fifth of the sailors on board who he's striking. What happened that evening was, in Baudin's word, just a worse version of what had been happening on his ship for some time. He was waging a losing battle against civilian scientists paying sailors for plants, animals, and shells. This sheds light on his earlier order that the sailors were to hand them all over to me, i.e. not to the scientists, an order which was obeyed no better than his order forbidding payment in alcohol. For Baudin, it was the scientists rather than the sailors that were to blame. Baudin's expedition was overloaded with civilian scientists, not chosen by Baudin or the Ministry of Marine, but by a commission established by the French National Institute. The story often told about Baudin's expedition is the story of how hard he found it to keep the scientists from rebelling against his orders and subverting his control. And unlike civilian scientists, sailors could be governed by the rules and customs of naval discipline. Baudin's ships witnessed the normal sorts of indiscipline common on 18th century voyages. Sailors were punished for incompetence, for desertion, for verbal, for physical altercations. The most common punishment on Baudin's ship was flogging or being placed in irons, sometimes for some extended periods. Giving and taking alcohol rations was also a power that the captain used to reward and punish, an economy of discipline. Double rations were rewarded after the crew successfully replaced a 4-gallon mast on the 6th of December, 1800, but mostly alcohol was strictly controlled. Incidents linked to drunkenness were not uncommon when the ship was at port, but rare while it was at sea. There's one big exception. On the night of the 24th to the 25th of December, 1800, Christmas, the crew on watch got so drunk that 2 of them blundered onto the quarterdeck and tried to smash open the deck containing the midshipmen's provisions, seemingly oblivious to the fact that the officers were on deck at the time. A search ordered by Baudin found that a small cask of Canary wine owned by the civilian artist Pierre-Louis Lebrun, which he had stored with his personal possessions between decks, had been partially emptied. Baudin punished his sailors by cutting their daily alcohol rations until they had forgone as much wine as they had pilfered. A further 8 days' abstinence was imposed on those who got drunk, but he didn't actually apply 8 days' abstinence to people who managed to stay sober. But you can see here how alcohol is part of discipline. Baudin's problem was not only that the civilian scientists were not subject to the system of naval discipline, but that their profligacy with rum, when paying for natural history specimens, was undermining one of the primary means of discipline in war, an award he had in his arsenal. Even though he was delighted to discover the dugong, the price of naturalist employ of sailor collectors was just too high. So the fact that civilian scientists caused trouble was perceived not just by Baudin, but also by his officers. An ensign on Baudin's mission, I'm probably way behind at this point. There we go. An ensign on Baudin's mission, French explorer Louis de Freycinet, his most daring decision as he prepared to command his own circumnavigation in the Uranie in 1817 was to ban civilian scientists from the upcoming expedition. Freycinet's successor, Isidore Duperrey, Dumont d'Urville, continued the same policy. The assistants and gardeners who accompanied the civilian scientists were also eliminated. This would have pleased Baudin's lieutenant, Guy Caldetuche, who in his journal in January 1801 groused about the jardiniers' expectation that they should be treated better than sailors. even though, in Guy Caldetuche's opinion, they were just porters. The mission would be better off, Guy Caldetuche thought, with a few good sailors in their place. So refusing to take civilians, Freycinet and his successors tasked Marine Service doctors and pharmacists with the work of natural history. Sailor labor replaced that of assistants. It was not quite as simple as that, however. Sailors' motivations and interests when it came to collecting had not changed a great deal in the decades following Baudin's mission. They still wanted to be compensated for their efforts, but within the constraints of what was best for ship's discipline. The price naval doctors and pharmacists were able to pay was much more limited. So on occasion, sailors found ways to make it clear that they thought they deserved more in return for their collecting work. In the Solomon Islands, the sailors of Dumont d'Urville's astrolabe took pleasure grabbing up shellfish that looked like they were worthy of it being added to the natural history collection before the scientists got there, so they couldn't get them. This was in retaliation for the fact that their previous collecting efforts had not been compensated for, quote, with even a quart of wine in exchange. So without the free flow of rum and wine to lubricate the economy of natural history collecting on board, then sailors as collectors became unpredictable. For sailors to be reliable collaborators, naval explorers had to work out a different way of compensating them. And so over time, we see a shift away from thinking of sailors as an army of low-skilled collectors towards an investment in skilled individuals. When Isidore de Paris put together a crew for his circumnavigation mission on the Coquille in 1823, he gave preference to some of the sailors who had sailed on the Uranie. One of these was the master gunner, Thomas Pierre Roland. I think it's just slow. There we go. Thomas Pierre Roland. Roland's credentials were related directly to his usefulness as a natural history collector. He was, during his time in the Uranie, an excellent marksman, a hunter both intrepid and skillful, according to Duparet. Duparet offered Roland personal incentives to join his expedition. Roland's son, Honoré, needed medical care. Before Roland set sail on the Coquille, Honoré was admitted to a hospice civil in Toulon in July 23, and 10 francs a month went directly from Roland's salary, monthly salary, to pay for his care. Duparet also gave a berth on the Coquille to Roland's nephew, Benoît, as a novice ship's cook. Finally, Roland also received the Cross of the Legion of Honor on his return from the Coquille mission in 1825, which is magic that I think a normal sea captain can't do. A Legion of Honor cross is a deal. So on the Coquille, Duparet regularly selected Roland to accompany scientific parties inland. The significance of Roland's role as a collector is illustrated by the credit given to him by one of the expedition's naturalists, René Primevère Lesson. In his account of the Coquille's anchorage in the Bay of Islands in New Zealand in 1824, the naturalist singled out Roland, for whose willingness and zeal I cannot express enough gratitude. The fact that Roland was recognized by name, unlike the anonymous sailors who brought back the dugong to Baudin, underlines this shift from seeing the benefit of sailor collecting in terms of an economy of scale to regarding it in terms of an economy of skill. Roland was compensated for his services not just through the provisions made for his family, but also the relative freedom he enjoyed while going ashore. Roland went regularly on solo hunting expeditions. In Doré, in New Guinea, for example, Roland returned from a solo hunt with a tiger bittern and a mustached martinet, both of which were subsequently classified and named by their discoverer, Lesson. So I do not know if this is Roland or not, because obviously the image doesn't say. It is just illustrative, but it is from the right mission in the right place. The other thing I could show you are the specimens. The birds that Roland actually shot that day are in the Museum of Natural History in Paris, with, of course, the demands make no mention of Roland. Sailor skills were not limited to marksmanship. As he prepared the birds Roland shot for him for transport back to Paris, Lesson also drew regularly on the services of another sailor, Jean Grimard. We know less about Grimard than we know about Roland, but we do know that Lesson chose Grimard to work as his infirmier, his nurse. Grimard, like Lesson, hailed from the western city of Rochefort. He was skilled at skinning birds. As Lesson's nurse, Grimard no longer had to work in the rigging. He spent the majority of his time inside the ship, protected from the worst of the elements. The price of natural history work then was a post in the relative comfort of the ship's infirmary. Lesson, who gave credit to Roland as a huntsman, was in contrast scathing about Grimard's effort to learn the science of natural history. Grimard kept a journal, which Lesson describes as very curious, by virtue of the grotesqueness of his expressions and the lies which he seasoned every line. I read several pages, he continued, which made me laugh out loud. Describing Grimard's journal as grotesque in his printed account of the voyage, immediately after having credited Roland as a principal resource when it came to specimens, suggests Lesson's desire to emphasize to audiences back home that sailor natural historians needed to know their place. He suggested that he thought they needed to know their place. He was willing to recognize and praise technical expertise, but sailors had no business developing or asserting any sort of scientific knowledge. So during Baudin's mission in 1803, using sailors as collectors destabilized naval discipline on board ship. The economy of natural history collection operated separately from the normal systems of rewards and punishments used on the ship to maintain order. Baudin's efforts to prohibit rum being used as payment and his attempt to close down the marketplace by asserting personal ownership of specimens returned to ship both failed in face of an exchange in which both civilian scientists and the sailors believed they were getting a good deal. Baudin's successors removed civilian scientists from the equation, and a new breed of sailor natural historians, represented in this paper by Roland and Grimard, were compensated not with rum, but with a range of less problematic perks. Extra pay and benefits, more time ashore, the advantages of a particular role on ship. These perks did not upset the structure of discipline on the ship, they did not end up in boozy brawls, and the evidence points to the fact that both Roland and Grimard were good collaborators. The price that naval natural historians were not willing to pay sailors was a share in the scientific credit for their discoveries. Roland's expertise as a marksman may have been recognized by the naval officers he sailed with, but he ended up working in a cartridge factory between missions. Grimard, labeled as grotesque, disappeared entirely from the official record after his return to France. When their ships docked in France, the naturalist voyagers who worked turned their attention to curating their collections and publishing their discoveries. Sailor collectors did not. They were ordinary sailors once again.
Well, good afternoon. It's an honor to be in here, and it's my responsibility to bring you to the Portuguese-speaking world now. My presentation is going to be about how a naturalist is born, how an expedition is done, and how it is forgotten after that, and what today we can do to rescue the memory of such expeditions and what was their importance and current importance to science. The challenge will be do this in 15 minutes. Okay, so let's start with the main character of this expedition, Alexandre Rodrigues Ferreira. So Alexandre Rodrigues Ferreira was born in 1756 in Salvador of Bahia, the then capital of the colony of Brazil, then a Portuguese colony. So Bahia was an important hub for commerce, but also political, and Ferreira was probably a son of a Portuguese merchant involved in the slave trade. So when he initially pursued his ecclesiastical studies in Bahia, trained to be a priest was a very common thing for the people of medium and high society there. But in 1770, he departed Brazil to mainland Portugal to study in the University of Coimbra, one of Europe's oldest universities. So Coimbra was established in 1290 and then was reformed in 1772, following the Enlightenment principles and establishing new museums, a natural history course, and that's what Ferreira followed. So Ferreira studied in the natural history. He was a student of Domingos Vandelli, or Domenico Vandelli, a Paduan naturalist that founded natural history studies in Portugal. And this is the museum in Coimbra where Ferreira studied, and some of the specimens that are there were there at the time Ferreira studied and used them for his studies. It's also interesting that Vandelli himself, the professor, was a correspondent of Linnaeus, and he was one of the main responsibles to bring the Linnaean system to Portugal, especially with works like this, a dictionary of the natural history terms translated to Portuguese that then he applied to the teachings in Coimbra and forming a new generation of naturalists in Portugal. So after graduating, after doing his PhD in natural history in Coimbra, Ferreira moved to Lisbon, to the Royal Cabinet of Natural History in Ajuda, near Lisbon. So the Royal Cabinet of Natural History was basically the equivalent of the Cabinet du Roi in Paris. It was the royal collections where everything from the Portuguese Empire were amassed and studied. Vandelli, the professor in Coimbra, was also the director, and while here Ferreira was trained and made it like he was trying to better his techniques to go on missions to the overseas. For this, he and other naturalists prepared a method on how to collect, preserve, and ship back to the museum specimens of natural history. This was basically an overview of everything that was published at the time, and they did this as to show that they were worthy to be selected to participate in what was called the Philosophical Voyages. So the Philosophical Voyages was an initiative by the Portuguese Crown to basically catalog, describe the natural productions of the vast overseas empire at the time. It was clearly a colonial enterprise and with physiocratic goals. The idea was to catalog everything that was important to be used as economy and medicine. And for this, all the naturalists that were trained in Coimbra and then trained in Ajuda went to these Philosophical Voyages in Brazil, in Cabo Verde, Angola, Mozambique, and Goa. So Ferreira departed to Brazil in 1783, and when he arrived, he had to explore the equivalent of today crossing the globe, so 40,000 kilometers. In Brazil, he counted with the local support of a wide constellation of actors from the colonial administration. This was a crown initiative, but also military officers, the clergy, private European colonies, but also local indigenous people that helped him all across these travels there. It was a difficult expedition. Ferreira survived, but many of the people in the expedition didn't survive. And they basically used the rivers as the main pathways. Of course, they also went to collect in some parts on the land. This is the overview of where they were. And you can see it covers very different habitats, from the Amazonian forest to the Cerrado in the middle of Brazil to the Pantanal in the south. So basically these are, at the time, were almost unknown to science, and today they are currently one of the most threatened habitats in South America, in fact in the world. So during this expedition, Ferreira prepared hundreds, dozens of shipments to Lisbon, and we have the list of all these shipments, and they contain a vast diversity of materials, from ethnographical materials to zoological specimens to plants to illustrations, to reports, to manuscripts. So all of this was sent to Lisbon, to the Royal Cabinet of Ajuda. We have, interestingly, we still have almost all of this list, so we can understand what to collect and when and where. So besides the animals and plants, they also provided a lot of illustrations that were done by an illustrator accompanying the expedition. And these illustrations covered everything, from landscapes to architecture to people to animals to plants. Interestingly, while he was doing the expedition, he recognized that he was looking to new things to science. This is one case. This is the mata-mata turtle that Ferreira collected in the first year of the expedition. And he understood it was new to science. At least he thought it was new to science. And he provided this description in Latin, a really good Latin description following the Linnaean system. He provided a name for it, Testudo torticollis, and this is the actual specimen that this illustration was based, and this would be the holotype of that species. Of course, he never published it, so it was not valid. So then Ferreira returned to Portugal in 1792, and he was entrusted with the interim direction of the Cabinet of Ajuda. So this was kind of a bad gift to him, because he basically became buried in logistical and bureaucratic issues. So he was not able to work on his collections. Also, part of his collection, when he arrived, he realized that were not well preserved. Also important to tell you and to remind you that at this time, Brazil was close to other European powers. But European naturalists were really eager to study the Brazilian biodiversity or the Brazilian natural history. And there was an opportunity that came after a few years. So in 1807, the Napoleonic army invaded Portugal. And this was a campaign that across Europe and reached Lisbon very quickly. Of course, the Portuguese crown fled to Rio de Janeiro, escaping, so Portugal was never capitulated. But of course, there was a lot of problems in Lisbon because of the French invasion. And what did the French do? Cuvier, at the time a director of the Paris Museum, requested Napoleon himself to send a naturalist to Lisbon just to go to the collections of Ajuda. And the person that was chosen to this task was Geoffroy de Saint-Hilaire, that went to Lisbon to go directly to the Ajuda collections and select and request to France anything that was deemed interesting. We still have the passport of Saint-Hilaire allowing him to visit the Ajuda collection, but we also have the catalog of specimens he selected. And it was a huge request for specimens. So 76 mammals, 387 birds, 100 fishes, a lot of shells, and 5 herbaria from the cabinet of Ajuda. Of course, this happening didn't help Ferreira work. Ferreira became depressed, Ferreira was already ill, and he actually ended up dying in 23 April of 1815. So his documents were kind of scattered. The collection remained in Ajuda, the ones that were not taken by the French, and he actually died without publishing anything. There was a lot of eulogies from the Lisbon Academy of Science, but there's no portrait known of him. So you ask, who is that guy there? So we don't know, but we assume that is him. Let me tell you this story. So we are researching Ferreira's life and work, and we recently found this picture that it's claimed to be him. It was on a loan, a recent loan, and things point that can be him. It has a lot of naturalist impressions that it's from that time. So it can actually, we are still doing research to understand if it's him or not. One thing that can help to sort it out is that I met Ferreira grandson in Brazil. So we can probably try to see if there's any similarities between them. This is just a small joke on it, but I think it was funny to say. So the collections, when they left Lisbon and arrived in Paris, so they were completely relabeled. And one thing is for sure, the name of Ferreira never appeared in the labels of the collections that were taken there. So the all collections that went to Paris became relabeled as Cabinet of Ajuda, Cabinet of the King of Portugal, or even the Mission of Saint-Hilaire to Portugal. So no name of Ferreira. Interestingly, though, these collections were studied by the most famous and important naturalists, European naturalists of that time. This includes, for example, some of the most iconic fauna of South America. So the pirarucu, for example, the large river fish from the Amazon, was described by Cuvier based on the specimen collected by Ferreira. The howling monkeys, also the same thing. And this is the same for most of the big animals that we recognize from the Amazon. But the name of Ferreira completely disappeared from memory. Interestingly, this monkey here, the howling monkey, was described by Humboldt by a specimen collected by Ferreira. So it's an interesting thing how we sometimes we have these eras in science that we know so much about them, but we forget some other naturalists that became lost in the process, and this is one of the things we are trying to recover. So one of the projects that I have currently is to go back to look to Ferreira's reports, manuscripts, specimens, illustrations, and try firstly to catalog them, to map them, because many of them, they are not even labeled. So we have to do this detective work in collections to try to locate all of this. So you also can ask, where are the Ferreira collections then? So they are dispersed through 3 countries at this point: in Portugal, in France, and in Brazil. In Portugal, they are in the National History Museum in Lisbon, the Academy of Science of Lisbon, and the Science Museum of the University of Coimbra. In France, they are, of course, in the Paris Museum. And in Brazil, they are in the Library of Rio, and also in the Library of the National Museum of Rio. In Lisbon, unfortunately, we don't have much left in the National Museum. So the Lisbon Museum burned down in 18 March 1978, and all the zoological collection, except few things that survived, were destroyed. One of the few things that got destroyed is this fin of this specimen collected by Ferreira. So this is a photo from the 70s before the fire of that specimen of Ferreira, and that's the fin that survives. What also survives in the archives are the manuscripts and the catalogs about this collection that we still have there. And of course, the illustrations and the manuscripts. That's a big bulk of our research now. In the Lisbon Academy of Sciences, in 1795, Ajuda sent some specimens to the collection of the Academy of Science, and we still have specimens there that we are locating. This is a difficult work at sometimes, because some of these specimens don't have labels, and we have to rely this identification on the taxonomic identity of these animals, because we know that these specimens are in fact from the 18th century, and when we can identify the species, we can trace that species to the place where Ferreira collected or not, or anyone else has collected. So this is one of the cases we are doing with the Academy of Sciences. Also in Coimbra, there was a shipment of specimens in 1806 to enrich the collections, that we still have things from Ferreira that are related to even to illustrations that he produced. And of course the National History Museum in Paris, where a lot of these specimens still are, and they are type specimens of new species, so a lot of those animals that I talked to you about. One of the really interesting things to merge the archive, the illustrations, and the specimens is that you find so much more information that sometimes remains hidden. So this is the case of this black panther that Ferreira collected. He mentions it a lot in many of the manuscripts on the shipments, and he notes on the illustration that it has a white chest. Of course, you can't see it from here, but then I show you this. This is the exact specimen, and because of this, we can now say where this animal was collected and when it was collected, getting it back to Ferreira expedition. And of course, in Rio, we still have a lot of the illustrations that were sent there. So what it brings us here, the message I want to tell you is that natural history is facing a renaissance, and it's very important for us, both historians and biologists, to work together and go back to this information and bring this information to the 21st century, because this information is not only interesting for the history of science, but we are talking about some of the most threatened habitats in the planet, and these specimens and this information can provide this really important information that will help us to study and conserve the biodiversity in this place. And thank you very much for your attention.
Hello, everyone. I want to thank the hosts, front of house and back of house, for making this conference happen, and all of the participants for their research. It's been a sensory experience of a conference so far. And I want to talk about legacies today. The lives of brothers John and Joseph LeContes began and ended in places of natural splendor. They were born among the rich abundance of the Blackwater swamps of Georgia's coastal plain on Woodmanston Plantation. They died after decamping from the South during Reconstruction for prestigious academic appointments in Northern California. John in his Berkeley home, and Joseph on a final excursion in Yosemite Valley. Their origins resembled main trends in the history of natural history. Formative years spent amidst enslaved labor, botanical curiosity, and gentleman's science. The closure of their lives marked the institutional specialization of modern science. Their lives coursed through major organizations, Harvard and Columbia, the universities of Georgia and South Carolina, the fledgling University of California, the American Philosophical Society, the Sierra Club, just to name several. The LeContes name is on buildings, schools, mountains, 3 that I know of, lakes, a glacier and its fjord, an Alaska ferry boat, a sparrow, a crystallized sulfate from bat guano, and even a street I played on as a kid, a fact that escaped me until last month. I won't go on, but I could. You get the point. Their lives traced the arc. Indeed, they helped sort of create the arc from natural history to modern science. And their legacy touches American life at many levels. What I want to examine today is how Americans have remembered the LeContes by way of forgetting an essential piece of the story, the enslaved laborers who constituted much of the labor and expertise that underwrote LeConte endeavors. But this was not simply Americans forgetting or denying slavery's nature. The LeContes, especially Joseph LeConte, shaped their legacy using using the power of biography, crafting narratives that tied the Confederate lost cause mythology to a disinterested commitment to what Joseph called pure abstract science. Slavery's realities were ignored in a second way. 20th century preservation efforts surrounding Woodmanston Plantation centered not on the majority of the community who lived there, nor much at all of its nearly 340 acres, but upon its having several fine specimens of the tree Camellia japonica, a jewel of Southern gardening. And if you ever read Southern Living, you've probably come across many articles. This is a botanical example of the kind of fragmentary memorialization described by historian Megan Kate Nelson. Examining the LeConte brothers' careers and the transition from botany to ornamental gardening, I hope, allows us to link the rise of natural history with the study of Confederate memorialization and the memory or forgetting of aspects of 19th century American slavery. This is, you can see LeConte Plantation about 40 miles southwest of Savannah, about equidistant between Savannah and the Altamaha River, which is the green ribbon in the bottom left of the image there. To Joseph LeConte, Woodmanston Plantation was an idol, a rural paradise of boyhood freedom and natural curiosity, a place where four young brothers roamed liberally, hunting, fishing. They made their own guns and gathering specimens from the forests and swamps, returning to their father, the patriarch scientist, for impromptu seminars on classification. Woodmanston was surrounded by botanical abundance, which is why William Bartram and others explored the region. The LeConte family held in Woodmanston their own personal field for exploration. This tale of naturalist origins resembles what we know of botanical history. Recent scholarship has described botany's imperial frame and colonial form. Woodmanston was a functioning plantation and large by the standards of Liberty County, Georgia. Woodmanston was home to approximately 230 enslaved people in 1838 when the father died, making it one of the county's largest operations. The bondspeople of Woodmanston produced Sea Island cotton, rice, and corn. They built, used, and maintained the engineering works that made it all possible. Their lives would have followed low-country patterns, which meant ordinary exposure to the debilitating consequences of working in swamp waters and subtropical temperatures that were bad enough to make wealthy Georgians retreat to fresher climes each summer. Woodmanston slaves also would have faced the intense nutritional deficits of the rice plantations, and they sought to mitigate that threat through cultivation of their own gardens. Gardens. This is the connecting point between the rise of the two esteemed American scientists and the enslaved people who were coerced to sponsor their careers. As low-country slaves tended their own gardens, planting vegetables to forestall the destruction of planters' cost minimalization, the LeContes kept a botanical garden that drew international attention. One botanist touring from London described the LeConte garden as being, quote, decidedly the richest in bulbs I have ever seen, and their luxuriance would astonish those who have only seen like bulbs in England. Early modern botanical gardens, of course, were not simple sites of ornamental charm. They were laboratories in the rise of botany. Their value was meant to be useful, especially medicinally and economically useful. The Woodmanston Botanical Garden evidently worked in this way. It was part of Louis LeConte's naturalist pursuits and paralleled his efforts in experimental science, which he conducted also in a chemical laboratory at the estate. The garden at Woodmanston, despite its remote location in a swamp 40 miles southwest of Savannah, was an extension of the Atlantic world of natural history. Lewis's training in natural history occurred in New York under physician-botanist David Hossick and continued in medicine at the New York College of Physicians and Surgeons. From his Georgia plantation, Lewis, the father, if I didn't mention that, ventured into the interior region of the Altamaha River, collecting botanical specimens, extending naturalists' knowledge of the American Southeast. In all these pursuits, enslaved laborers were involved but rarely received credit, which makes me think of French sailors. Enslaved people supported natural history at Woodmanston in two main ways. At the general level, Woodmanston was a typical coastal plantation. The rice economy was indebted to the intellectual capital, not just the physical labor of enslaved people. The over 200 slaves at Woodmanston provided Louis LeContes the income and time to pursue botany and chemistry. More specifically, an enslaved man named Dick was assigned to the garden, tasked with, quote, keeping it in order. This job perhaps brought Dick's status in the plantation community, as specialized labor tended to do, but it also brought the weighty responsibility of ensuring the health of the botanical garden, the plantation's most distinctive asset, and the pride of my father, as Joseph recalled. Beyond the work of gardener Dick, the collecting of the LeContes would have been undergirded by Woodmanston slaves. Enslaved people in the Low Country traveled regularly to socialize and to hunt and fish. Sometimes travel was illicit, other times sanctioned. Whether to evade patrols or to pursue game, coastal Georgia's enslaved people had geographic expertise that paralleled and often surpassed white knowledge. One need not strain to assume that Louis LeContes' collecting exhibitions along the Altamaha River were conducted by enslaved guides and porters. Perhaps Louis LeContes' slaves also brought specimens for examination in addition to the botanical garden. Woodmanston was a large plantation, but that brought it little distinction. The Georgia coast was a world of wealthy plantations. The botanical garden, however, made Woodmanston a special site of Enlightenment science in a rugged peripheral zone. Joseph called it the beautiful, beloved garden, noting that their father spent much of his time, mornings and afternoons, there. Not only did the garden provide Louis LeContes his passion and his local and international reputation, it was the first school ground for John the physicist and Joseph the geologist. Joseph credited the foundation of his scientific education to the daily companionship of my father, which often occurred at his side in the garden. The garden, gathered and maintained within slavery, was thus a foundation of the brothers' rise into scientific eminence. They claimed rarely to have left the environs of their plantation until departing for their formal educations in the 1830s. From then, their professional lives followed paths of institutional science that took them from the South to New York and to Boston, back to the South, and eventually to California. Along the way, John's and Joseph's reputations were celebrated by contemporaries, but Joseph himself framed his family's legacy for posterity. His autobiography was said to have begun simply as reminiscences by an aging father to an ailing daughter, but in published form it became a narrative of American scientific progress, partially wrapped in the mythology of the Confederate lost cause. He did similar memorial work in his memoir of John LeContes, which he delivered to the National Academy of Sciences in 1894. The point is not that Joseph hid his family's connection to slavery. Far from it. Rather, in tone and focus, slavery was relegated to the mists of their southern origins. The lost cause framing placed the plantation firmly in the past and in the East, and nostalgically remembered enslaved people as loyal and docile. The brothers' work on behalf of the Confederacy was patriotic, to be sure, but it was also cast as the work of gentlemen on behalf of science. For example, John, the elder brother, was commissioned a Confederate major and given direction of the niter works in Columbia, South Carolina, but, quote, never donned the uniform, according to his brother Joseph. For his own part, Joseph was named chemist in the Niter and Mining Bureau of the Confederate States, and also given major rank, but claimed it was done without solicitation on my part. Joseph explained that while Sherman's army scorched its way toward Columbia, the brothers produced scholarship. John, he said, wrote, quote, papers of pure abstract science, in strange contrast with the furious political storm then raging. Writing up the turn of the 20th century, Joseph held up his brother as an exemplar of, quote, unvarying and entire disinterestedness. Purity and abstraction of science typically suggest the quest for knowledge for its own sake, free from concern for application, hence the distinction from applied science. But Joseph LeContes tied pure science to disinterestedness, casting his brother's legacy as not so much separated from application and industry, but from worldly concerns. That separation takes on particular resonance in the legacy of former Confederates. The LeContes did not deny their slave-owning and Confederate past, but their legacy moved beyond it. Like some other Confederates, moving west allowed them a new story in an area imagined as set apart from the political strife of the East, as historian Heather Richardson and others have written. While many former Confederate leaders were memorialized in the South, the LeContes were memorialized as much in the American West as in the South. That their name adorns landmarks and buildings in the western states still stands as testament to their contribution to science and environmentalism. And this Western memorialization has largely overshadowed their Confederate memorialization. The LeContes did not entirely let go of the South, and the South did not let go of the LeContes. Just as Joseph looked back upon the beautiful, beloved garden, a group of Georgians in the 20th century worked to preserve Woodmanston's plantation legacy, not so much as a working plantation, but as the site of the remarkable botanical garden. Joseph had noted that his father's, quote, especial pride was 4 or 5 camellia trees in the garden. The camellia japonicas became the focus of memory. Before the Civil War, people traveled to Woodmanston expressly to glimpse these extraordinarily large camellia japonicas, especially the celebrated double white variety, with the botanical illustration here. Nearly 30 years after moving to California, Joseph returned to Woodmanston and appreciated the enduring camellia. That's him in the shade under the tree. And everybody talked about how magnificently large it was and the others around it. That effort, by the 1970s, an effort was underway to add the plantation to the National Register of Historic Places. That effort took significant voluntary labor and contributions by archaeological and preservation professionals. This marshaling of labor was in large part an effort of botanical preservation. The camellia family is part of Atlantic imperial history. Camellia sinensis provides the world's tea and was, of course, a major global commodity of the early modern era. Camellia japonica, however, has an Atlantic world history rooted largely in aesthetics. The plant is considered an ornamental, prized for the beauty of its flowers. Camellia japonica has since been an aesthetic staple of Southern gardening. Not coincidentally, the American Camellia Society is headquartered in the state of Georgia. Woodmanston Plantation was granted a place on the National Register of Historic Places, largely because of its elite gardening history. The report at the center of the National Register application was titled The Louis LeContes Botanical and Floral Garden. Whereas the origins of natural history and botany were linked to utility, as historian James Del Borgo and others have written, and Woodmanston's productive wealth was based on large-scale labor exploitation, the preservation of Woodmanston was based on the importance of what the application to the National Register called, quote, fine gardening. That was in 1973. The shift from utility and commodity history to ornamentalism is traceable in LeContes' memoir and historic preservation. Remembering the ornamental parts of the garden because of the tie to refined beauty and scientific inspiration has allowed in some ways the forgetting of the functional parts of the plantation, most of the land, commodities, and the people that underwrote the rise of the LeContes into the highest plane of American science in the 19th century. And as this final slide suggests, the struggle of memory continues with Woodmanston Plantation to this day. This is a sign, poster board, left in an abandoned trailer on the property by volunteers. No money, no volunteers, no progress, no maintaining, preserving the beauty, sad face. Too many vandals, no respect. 2 old people tried for 2 years. And then the bottom of the second sign suggests that this was the second attempt to preserve the plantation. Thank you very much.
Hi, everyone. I'm Ari Hammond. I am the Research Library, or no, that's not it, Director of Research Library and Archives at the San Diego Natural History Museum. I'm going to try to speak as fast as I can, but as a Californian, that's not really my natural state. So hopefully we can get through all of this. I'm here today to talk about community science, and this is the permanent exhibit in our museum dedicated to community science. So, community science, also called citizen science or participatory science, is the idea that one does not need to have formal scientific training to contribute to our understanding of the natural world. Community scientists contribute to natural history in myriad ways, from collecting and mounting specimens, to documenting and illustrating nature, to organizing collections. The projects they work on can be large or small scale and are initiated by a community, an organization, or an individual. Many community scientists participate in scientific activities simply because they find it interesting. And though the structure of community science projects vary widely, one component is consistent. Community scientists are often unpaid. Occasionally, they benefit in other ways, such as through citation in an academic paper, or by gaining technical skills, or in rum, as we've seen. But since community scientists are not often paid for their labor, their work is not subject to labor laws, which I find very interesting. And historically, females have greatly impacted the field of natural history through community science, and they continue to do so today. So today I will discuss 3 historical community scientists and the ways that class, gender, race, culture, and motivation affected their work. It can be challenging to find examples of female community scientists because, as we've heard, for much of history, Anonymous was a woman. This is not actually a Virginia Woolf quote, but everyone thinks it is. Much of the labor in natural history museums comes from volunteers and artisans, who are often not named, and women in particular are often not credited for their work. While their participation is often lost to history, in many ways, their work is the unseen labor upon which natural history stands. While most female community scientists have remained anonymous throughout history, in this talk I will highlight the following 3 women: Mary Anning, Anna Atkins, and Margaret Wood Bancroft. Mary Anning was born in 1799 and passed away in 1847. She went from being a literal footnote in the scientific record to being called the greatest fossilist the world ever knew. She grew up in the town of Lyme Regis on the coast of England. Her family was working class. Her father sold fossils, and from him she learned to collect, cut, polish, and sell fossils. She was not formally educated, but she was able to read and taught herself geology, anatomy, and French. Her father passed away when Anning was only 10 years old, leaving the family deeply in debt. Anning continued the fossil selling business with the support of her mother and brother, and the Anning siblings discovered an ichthyosaur when Mary was 12 and her brother was 15. This discovery brought a great deal of paleontological attention to the Anning family business, but when the specimen was described to science, the publication failed to note who had actually collected it. Anning went on to discover a plesiosaur when she was 24 years old. She was again not mentioned in the scientific publication. And at 29, she discovered a pterosaur and was finally credited for her discovery by paleontologist William Buckland. What's particularly interesting about Anning is the impact that class and matrimony had on her contemporary reputation. Upper-class women at the time were allowed to contribute to paleontology and geology, and the wives of prominent paleontologists and geologists were applauded for their assistance with their husband's work. But being both poor and unmarried, Anning's reputation was mixed within both the Lyme Regis and scientific communities. Some regarded her as unpleasant, prim, and vinegar-looking, which I find particularly rude, while others called her kindly and with the sweetest temper. When she passed away at 47, The town regarded her as an oddity that they had lost. And though there was a tongue-twisting rhyme created about her, for many years Anning remained a scientific footnote, and it wasn't until recently, around 1995, in a conference and paper much like this one, that her story began to be told and gained wider recognition. Anna Atkins lived from 1799 to 1871, and I want to thank Julia, wherever she is, for her talk yesterday introducing her. Anna Atkins was the first person to illustrate a book with photographs, and she may have been the first woman ever to take a photograph. A biographer noted that as an upper-class woman, Atkins had few formal professional opportunities, but abundant time and resources. Atkins studied botanical illustration, which was seen as a suitably genteel hobby for upper-class women of the era. They were allowed to study plants because the subject was feminine and ephemeral and had none of the unpleasantness of the dissecting room. It also did not require them to leave home. These women were allowed to informally study botany, but scientific pursuit was challenging. In 1836, the Botanical Society of London allowed female members, though many men disagreed with this position. Atkins joined in 1839, the same year her family friend William Herschel invented photography. She created the first scientific book, British Algae, 4 years later, as a companion to William Henry Harvey's Manual of British Algae, which we'll get back to later. Now, as we've seen, this was a really labor-intensive work, and Atkins appeared to have done most of it herself. She had to prepare the specimens, collecting, identifying, cleaning, arranging, pressing, and drying them. And then, for the photographs, cyanotypes, she cut paper, coated it with emulsion, dried the paper, arranged the specimens, added translucent labels, flattened them with glass, exposed them to sunlight, washed the prints, and re-dried them. All of this labor was only possible because of her class and race. And Atkins expected to make no income from this work. And she was not culturally allowed to publish this work herself. At the time, women could not publish their own scientific research. If they did anything, it had to be an accompaniment to a man's scientific publication. And even so, they were not allowed to distribute their companion works themselves. Atkins' father sent copies of her work to prominent scientists, acting as both a mediator and legitimizer of her work. Yet the rigor of her work and who she chose to send it to indicates that she wanted to contribute to science. And so for her, community science was the only way to enter this realm that was otherwise inaccessible. Oh, and finally, Margaret Wood Bancroft, who I'm a little bit obsessed with. She was born in 1893 and passed in 1986. Margaret Wood Bancroft was fearless in everything she did. She was born in Kentucky, the youngest of 8, and following years of poor family health and a devastating fire, the Wood family sought a better life in California. They settled in the inland mountains of San Diego County on the Witch Creek Ranch, a 15-acre ranch and hotel. At 10, Margaret declared she was a cowboy, and at 14, she left school to help with the ranch full-time. She became a trail guide and drove a team of horses 20 miles into town herself to sell goods and pick up guests staying at the hotel. Now, the ranch closed after her father's death in 1910, so, as a true Californian, Bancroft tried her hand at acting. She was a natural comedian and stuntwoman and worked in silent films with D.W. Griffith and Hobart Bosworth and became friends with Lillian Gish and Cecil B. DeMille. Now, during this time, a young Margaret Wood met Griffin Bancroft. The two quickly wed, even though Griffin was 14 years her senior and separated from his first wife, which was very scandalous at the time. But Margaret was set on the match and left the film industry and became a stepmother to Griffin's two young boys. She would take her stepsons out into nature and teach them about local flora and fauna. And during one of those excursions, the entire family was introduced to oology, which is the study of eggs, and which was reported in the paper. Griffin was hooked. He became a well-known ornithologist and oologist, and fearless Margaret accompanied him on every expedition. She was extremely knowledgeable and an active participant during these collecting trips, including once scaling a 100-foot cliff to reach an osprey nest, despite her husband saying that no woman had any business doing anything so dangerous. After going on expeditions with her husband and other male scientists, Bancroft decided to lead her own expedition through Baja California with her friend Bertie Mellon. And you can see on the bottom here is her packing list, which includes 20-gauge shotgun shells. During this trip, she discovered archaeologically important cave paintings and is credited with collecting snakes that were determined to be new species to science. Bancroft was also fearless in sharing this information, including in a book that she gifted/forced upon Eleanor Roosevelt. And though her husband Griffin has a lengthier scientific record, his work likely would not have been possible without Margaret. So, female community scientists today. Female community scientists today are continuing to change the world, undergoing female-only sailing expeditions to tackle single-use plastic in Expedition, note the double X, not the double X chromosome up there. They're also enduring winters in Svalbard to study climate change in Hearts in the Ice, and identifying species along the US-Mexico border, as seen as the iNaturalist Project Border BioBlitz, which at the San Diego Natural History Museum is led by a female team. The value of community science is also gaining wider recognition in modern society. The Association for Advancing Participatory Sciences was formed in 2013 and launched the journal Citizen Science, Theory and Practice a year later. The European Citizen Science Association was formed in 2014. At the NAT, we opened our permanent exhibit, Extraordinary Ideas from Ordinary People, in 2016. And in 2017, the U.S. Forest Service created a fund specifically for community science projects. However, the work is not yet done. Only 30% of participants on Zooniverse, a popular community science platform, are estimated to be female, even though community science is proven to be more effective when women participate. This is important because we still do not have gender parity in science. Less than 30% of the world's researchers are female. Women working in science are significantly less likely to be credited with authorship. And women outperform men in science undergraduate courses, yet are still perceived as less able. And in countries where women are not encouraged to pursue science, there is a larger interest in informal scientific activities. However, many platforms are on mobile devices such as Zooniverse and iNaturalist, and worldwide, some 327 million fewer women than men have smartphone and can access the mobile internet. So, in conclusion, community science is not without its criticisms of unpaid and unsung labor. However, it has an important role to play within the natural history landscape, and we can take steps to ameliorate the complex issues around it. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much to our wonderful panelists. I enjoyed reading your papers in advance of the panel and even more hearing them a second time today. And as Adriana alluded to in her introduction, these papers were not only wonderful in and of themselves, but I think they really helped to crystallize some of these ideas that have been sort of percolating throughout the conference. In particular, ideas about broadening historical actors in the pursuit of science as well as into today, who did the labor of natural history and who is able to be recognized as an expert. As well, your papers also, many of your papers also alluded to the kind of challenges that we face as historians in recovering these narratives. Hunter, I found your paper and this idea of historical erasure, whether in publications or in monuments. I think it's often said that monuments can be tools for forgetting as well as from remembering, and that was certainly brought forward by your paper. And then Luis, this kind of multi-layered sort of obliteration of historical actors in this competition between empires. And I'd love to hear as well, you talk a little bit about whether or not some of this research that you're pursuing enables us to recover any of the indigenous contributors to Ferreira's research. I appreciated, Ralph, in your paper, the capacity of laborers not to kind of sit easily into these hierarchies of natural history, to kind of push back and perhaps not always in ways that persisted beyond the kind of maritime space, but at least to trouble a little bit some of these social hierarchies. And I'd love to hear a little bit more about whether or not this relates to the maritime space in particular, given your focus on ships as a site of intellectual knowledge. Slightly more optimistically, I think throughout the conference we've heard about new kind of digital tools, thinking about new methodologies that enable us to kind of to do some of this work of uncovering these kind of multiple actors. So I'd love to hear you guys comment a little bit more about how you think from a kind of methodological perspective, or what kinds of digital tools you use in your research, or also in a museum space, how you think about attacking this often thorny problem of recovering these voices. So I don't know who wants to begin.
It's on. It's on.
Okay, so I can start. Regarding looking back and identifying the actors on all of these trips, not only Ferreira, but also everyone else that worked with him, including indigenous people, that we know it happened. I think the main challenge here at first moment is that we didn't even know where the specimens were. So the first step for us to really reach out to indigenous people was firstly to recognize that specimen is from that expedition, and from that to dig a little bit more. One of the things I've been doing, and I didn't have the time to present it in here, but is the fact that some of this, like, there's hundreds of, like, it was thousands of specimens were sent. About these, some dozens or hundreds survive. And what we see is that different specimens were prepared slightly different. So we can see these differences on the specimens themselves, the ways that the taxidermy were sewed, the materials that were used. Some of the materials that were used are based on plants from a certain regions, others from other regions. So what is fundamental in this case is for us to firstly identify the specimens, they are from this expedition. Afterwards, try to locate the specimens in space and time. When were they collected and where were they collected? And at that time also to try to understand who was participating in the expedition at that point. Because this was a 10-year expedition across different areas. And the indigenous people that participated sometimes belonged to a certain group, sometimes to another one. There are stories in the diaries of Ferreira about certain groups of indigenous people refusing to go further because that was the territory of another rival tribe. So the first thing for us is to identify the specimens and then to try to dig more after that. But yeah, it's so fundamental because this was not done by himself.
I'm going to talk about something you just talked about in a second, but just to start off, one of the reasons I work in what I work on is just the depth of documentation. You stick 100 people on a ship and 20 of them are writing journals. This is the kind of documentation that historians just dream about. And so compared to even a normal laboratory, you have a depth of basically of reported experience that you don't have in many other scientific endeavors. And so I think that the sort of resistance that I can track with my sailors, and there's a lot more going on, They don't want to tell us about the resistance, obviously, because that undermines their scientific authority. But the sort of resistance that's going on in my ships, I suspect, is going on in all sorts of ways. But it's just not. It's unless you have the depth of documentation that I have, you can't get to it. It's really difficult. So most of my sources are manuscript or printed, visual, obviously, and I did just have the conversation with Matthew Halley over lunch, in which I was going like, the ideal thing would be for me to actually know who prepared the specimens, because of my sailor bird skinner. Like, what does bird skinning actually mean in that context? How much is he actually learning about the process of bird skinning? We heard earlier about clipping feathers, and I heard a whole lot more from you and him since about how you make the incisions. In many ways, that is the kind of source that I would like to actually use in order to get at a true sense of who's doing the work. Unfortunately, as a historian, I don't have access to quite that level of technology, though. But maybe somebody will set me up.
One of the key problems with my project, which I'm at the very beginning of, so I'm really enjoying the opportunity to think about what sort of methodological approaches I'm going to take. But one of the key problems is that the Woodmanston site itself has experienced so much transformation, so much destruction and change. Rice plantation work creates indelible marks on a landscape. And in the low country of South Carolina and Georgia, you can see the dikes very clearly if you're looking for them. And there are efforts by conservation groups to use that human-altered environmental structure for migratory waterfowl conservation and that sort of thing. So I'm thinking a lot about how to try to think about telling the story of a landscape that has been told in a different way. The other issue is that the area of Woodmanston Plantation experienced a huge amount of large-scale timbering in the 20th century. There was an archaeological team that visited the site in the late 70s and determined that they were 40 or 50 years too late at that point. But because of imaging advances, I'm looking forward to sort of wrapping my head around imaging techniques and LiDAR and that sort of thing to try to get a sense of whether there's new data that can come or that people are studying this. There's a huge amount of work on the estuaries nearby that gets into all kinds of federal and state governmental agencies. So this is sort of a fun thing that I'm going to be digging into, not just camellias, but yeah, so we'll see where it goes.
Ralph, I want to get back to what you said about documentation. As somebody who operates an archive, it can be really difficult to decide what is going to be kept and what won't. And people save very different things. I have one researcher that I have 68 boxes of his archives, and another researcher where I have the slimmest folder of his work. And there are some times where people will say, hey, did we find this on this expedition in 1930? And I say, we have zero documentation. Doesn't mean it did happen, doesn't mean it didn't happen. So those things can be really difficult and challenging. I will say, I'm a fan of digitization for a couple of reasons. One, in libraries, we like to say lots of copies keep stuff safe. So physical, digital, JPEG, PDF, all formats. But I can make that available to other researchers who can go through and piece together different things from archives all around the world to kind of put together these stories. Are kind of detective stories, a lot of them, I think.
We can open up for questions in the audience.
This panel was fantastic. Thank you. Thank you
Can
all
you use
of
the
you.
microphone?
This panel was fantastic. Thank you very much. My thought is, how about offering all your recordings, the American Philosophical Society, to the public radio stations? I mean, they have these programs. sorry, they have these programs on nature, on history. This is perfectly fit into that.
Thank you so much for this panel. I had a question for Hunter and a question for Ralph. Hunter, I wonder if there are any moments in the sources that you have where you do see these kind of parallels in scale on the plantation kind of coming out of this gardening work that is occurring and the ways in which, you know, settler colonialism is viewing gardening work on an entirely different level. Are there moments in which that, like, labor and where your own actors are kind of seeing those parallels? And then for Ralph, you know, your sailors are swimming in alcohol, but so are specimens, right? You know, specimens are being kept in rum and anything that they can get their hands on. It's a great preservative. It's a great cleaning fluid. So I wonder, you know, thinking about the economy of specimens, you know, how does that play into it? I mean, maybe it didn't happen on this one, but it would have happened on others. And this is a precious resource that these damn animals are taking up.
So thinking about the ways in which the different gardeners were perceiving the others' gardening, and I haven't seen a huge amount of that specifically in my documents yet, because I'm at the very beginning of this research and haven't gotten into a lot of the manuscript material, which is 2,900 miles away from where I live. But there is a huge amount of rich historiography on the South Carolina and Georgia Low Country, especially the lives of enslaved people. So I'm able to pull on that. And so we know a great deal about gardening among enslaved people in that area and its relationship to time, preservation of time through the week, attempts by owners of enslaved people to try to regulate their time in gardening, even as they are relying upon those enslaved gardeners to produce their own food, because they're basically feeding them at particular times, especially in the 1840s, high starch diets that don't provide the proteins, fats, and vegetables other than corn-based foods, to labor efficiently and also just to live full lives. So I'm at this point kind of drawing on that body of scholarship to try to connect the two. The closest I get in the memoir, the published sources by the LeContes, is their sort of typical cant about African Americans as being their people. And for example, Joseph LeConte describes the gardener Dick as an old and intelligent Negro, which is just such standard language in the 19th century Southern sources, as part of that continuation of the pro-slavery thinking as it transformed out of the Civil War. But this is a great thing for me to look at, to see this envisioning going both ways. So I appreciate that question.
So I can't think of a single example where the needs of the alcoholic came up against the needs of the natural historian, except the ones I had. The main issue in terms of competition over space on ships is plants. There's a whole lot of history of people getting annoyed with plants, partly because plants take water, and water is also a very limited commodity on board ship. So plants going overboard, or natural historians being told, you're pressing your plants. We're not keeping this one alive. That is a regular occurrence on a number of different voyages. There was something else. No, I'm sorry. Yeah.
Once again, just a great panel. This question might seem more predictable after you hear my talk next session, but I mean, I'm very kind of interested in these papers and other ones about the relationship between nationalism and natural science, and the extent to which these projects, and those involved in them, how they construct their identities as international scientists, as members of particular national groups or subnational groups. So, for example, like, Hunter, it was really interesting the way that you talked about the LeContes in terms of this kind of lost cause Americanism infused with this, really kind of reprehensible, white supremacist post-Reconstruction kind of identity. With Luis, you're talking about certainly an Enlightenment project, but also one that was Portuguese, Brazilian, and end up the specimens and end up being victimized by the Napoleonic Wars and shipped to the Jardin des Plantes and the Natural History Museum there. And I don't know kind of what happens in the French South Seas. French Caledonia is in a lot of trouble right now, so I don't know exactly how that fits in, but it also works in with the kinds of citizen science that Ariel, you were talking about too, where to what extent does a gender identity and maybe a class identity conflict with or actually encourage a kind of national identity or a kind of broader scientific identity. So I'm just kind of interested in the identification of the individuals involved in this labor of natural history, and how that's kind of impacts what they're doing.
I do want to start off just with saying that there's a reason that we use the term community science at the San Diego Natural History Museum, because we are right next to the US-Mexico border. And for us, the term citizen science is extremely exclusionary. So there's actually a paper written about it, I think last year, that talked about this change from the term citizen science of the country that you're identifying with and whether you're allowed to be in that country and doing nature there and science there, and how participatory science, participating in it or being part of the community, is a bit more inclusive. And following that, for example, my museum, all of the panels are written bilingual. So for us, maybe it's even interesting to think about how being binational is part of our identity in Southern California.
I'll just say very briefly, what's interesting about the LeContes family is that there was also a branch that was a northern, that was in the north. Joseph and John's first cousin was the great beetle scientist, John Lawrence LeContes, and he served in the U.S. Army during the Civil War in a scientific capacity. So the family is particularly interesting in that nationalist framework, and especially as they move out into California and take that sort of eastern imprimatur into the West and start to become associated with things that are basically under the control of the Department of the Interior in terms of their names and the National Park Service.
Regarding so a little bit of the appropriation of Ferreira as a national symbol, it's a really interesting topic, because it all depends who you read. So despite this being mostly forgotten in modern historiography and also in academic circles, or mostly scientific circles, biology circles, Ferreira was used during the 19th century and early 20th century as a symbol, both for Portugal and both for Brazil. And it's interesting if you read biographies published in Brazil and those published in Portugal. Those published in Portugal depict him as this Euro-Portuguese naturalist. The Brazilian biographies depict him as this Euro-Brazilian naturalist that his results were spoiled by the Portuguese crown. So it's really interesting how these are appropriated by the different, because in fact he was born in colonial Brazil, son of a Portuguese during the colonial times, but he was born in Brazil. So it's an interesting way how naturalists can be appropriated by the political establishments.
So pick up any book about the Baudin mission, and they'll tell you it's about French imperialism, and so that in many ways is the baseline when you're working on any of these French voyages of the early 19th century. They're naval missions; they're paid for by the government. The government is not paying for them out of sheer and utter goodness of their heart. They're doing it in Baudin's case, allegedly, to map out a potential a Pacific empire for France. In later cases, all of the officers are thinking about empire, even if France is nowhere able to create an empire in the 1810s and the late 1810s and the 1820s. For me, though, and coming back to Ari's point, that is the baseline. Like, we know that these are basically endeavors for the glory of France and for the glory of Napoleon, and in terms of Baudin. But for me, basically, using that as the way to understand it, in many ways, doesn't help me understand the rest of the science that's going on. And so that's the label that I don't deal with in my work in many ways. The political label, I agree in its importance, and I don't argue against that work in any way. But for me, it isn't actually the important label to put on there.
So I know that there were some more questions, but I want to make sure that we get some time to breathe after this session. So I'm going to say that that's a good place to end. It's a nice transition into the final session. So if you have questions, please connect with our panelists during the coffee break, which will happen now. But before we have more coffee, please join me in thanking our presenters for this really spectacular session.